Good evening, good morning. Welcome to week 2 of PSSL 6240 here at George Washington University in the Safety and Security Leadership Program. I just want to welcome you to week 2, as well as to wish you and your families a happy Mother's Day. If you haven't called your mom yet today, please do so at the conclusion of this video. So as I mentioned earlier, I like to use YouTube a lot in our class just to give a wrap up the previous week, preview the next week, as well as give any announcements or any big issues that come up in the class. So expect this to happen every week, Saturday or Sunday, from here on in. So just start off with announcements. Just two upcoming dates. Adobe Connect session, 19 May at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I think I've briefed this to everyone or let everyone know that this is who's going to be briefing, who's in group 1. Again, it's a mandatory if you're going to brief, optional for everybody else. It's also a great way for office hours if you just want to talk about the class, talk about any issues that are coming up. That would be a great session. So for the briefing, again, not more than 20 to 25 minutes for the presentation, and that leaves about 5 or 10 minutes for questions. And then paper 1 is due 22 May 2016. Again, just 2 weeks from now. I just want to, don't start the paper until we get through this week. I will be giving very firm guidance on the paper next week in this YouTube session. You get an example. You also get a little bit more of what I'm looking for. For now, just focus on especially the second part of week 2 and focus on the discussion section for week 2. So the more you work on that, the better your paper will do. And I'll talk about that in a second. Keep up the effort. The way this class runs, I know how human nature is. You work real hard at the first week, and I was pretty impressed with everyone's discussion points for this week. And then you kind of just slide as the semester goes. That's just human nature. I ask that you put in the same level of effort that you for following weeks as you did for this past week. In fact, this is pretty much what I was looking for as far as discussion posts for this week. But again, the workload increases, papers increase, other life events happen, and you tend to slack off. Please keep up this level of effort. And then the last announcement, there's several DVDs I give in this class. All of them are online on YouTube YouTube is pretty much where they all are. Next week's One Day in September. Again, at this point, you don't need to buy it because it's on YouTube. So 1 week in September is online. Road to 9/11, which is required for week 3, that's online. Dirty War, which is the week 4 video, that's online. Road to 9/11, or the National Geographic documentary on 9/11 that we give in week 6, that's currently online too. So don't worry about buying anything now. They're all you can watch on YouTube for free. So just cover week 1, just kind of the thoughts, wrapping it up. Is terrorism an existential threat? I think the psychological impact, I think everyone said no, it wasn't an existential threat, but the psychological impact was the biggest factor. And again, you don't get the same psychological impact from vehicular accidents or suicides or any of those other policy issues that you get from terrorism. So that would bring me to the second question is that self-inflicted? Do we do that to ourselves? Or are we facilitating terrorism by reacting it or being so reactive to it and letting our media dominate terrorism? Do we facilitate that? And I'll leave you to answer that question. But again, when you think about the psychological impacts, you have to ask, what do we do to ourselves as a society? The last question, a third question I could ask is what can impact our way of life? And I talked about existential threats and what can impact our way of life. And I think everyone, maybe not everyone, but most people would agree, even a crime like September 11th, unless you're in the military or unless you flew a lot, really didn't affect your way of life on September 11th. despite the 3,000 people dying and the billions of dollars in damage. But there are things that can affect our way of life. A bioterrorist attack against our food supply or something like that, where we don't know what's going to happen next. That can have more cascading effects, even if the casualty count isn't as high as a bombing or even a September 11th or even a WMD attack, a biological attack or a cyber attack on our financial industry, where you can't, your ATM doesn't work or your bank accounts are suddenly zeroed out. That impacts our way of life and has incredible cascading effects. So, when you think about terrorism, again, 30 people dying in Belgium, as tragic as that is that really going to affect our way of life, even in Belgium or in the EU? Again, food for thought. And then the final point is what is in our control. And I alluded to this in one of the questions, and I should have alluded to it in the lecture. You can control for certain policy issues. For a car, you can drive sober. You can not drive at all. You can drive slowly. You can get one of those, automatic stops things that they have on cars now. You can control for those, so you're not one of the 35,000 people that die in vehicular accidents. In fact, you can statistically do a lot of things to make sure you're not one of those 35,000. Terrorism, for all intents and purposes, is random. You can just be going about your day, and you can do all the things that are right and still be killed in a terrorist attack. And I think that might warrant more policy and public scrutiny than any of those other large casualty causing issues that were discussed in the Atlantic article. So it's just, again, food for thought, something to keep in mind as we go through, as we close out week one. For week one, just so you know, this is kind of a scene setter. This will not be on the exam or tested or directly asked in a paper, but obviously these themes and these issues that are talked about in week one will cascade throughout the course. So again, just keep these lessons in the back of your head. So moving on to week two, just a quick preview. I've mentioned in one of the themes of this class is that terrorism, the nature of terrorism might change in some ways, but oftentimes the constant is a lot more important. And one of the things we're going to talk about in week two is the history of terrorism. And one of the things a terrorist group has to do is communications, or get out its message. Communication is probably not the best way to put it. I would say strategic messaging would be the best way to say it. How to get its message across. And this has been consistent. This objective has been consistent throughout the years. What you see on the top hand is the Irgun, and we're going to talk about that in week two, and that is the Israeli, really the group that started the state of Israel, and the terrorist group, the terrorist activity that kicked out the British. And what you see, that picture, there are two British sergeants that were hung by the Irgun. And that was designed specifically, and there's a photograph taken, to send a message out to within the Israeli world, as well as in London, where the British occupation was, where the British capital was, about the strength of the Irgun. And they used the technology of the day to get their message across. In this case, the technology was teletype messaging. Because of World War II, there had been advances in photography, and prior to World War II, if a newspaper wanted to publish a picture, it was from 2 weeks old because you couldn't send it over a wire service. With World War II, wire services where you could send pictures instantaneously started to prop up, and the Irgun took advantage of it. It was the YouTube of the day, the way to get your message out worldwide in a rapid manner. And that picture again was used to send a message. The Irgun used that communications device. What you see in the middle there is Black September, and you're going to see this in extent in the One Day in September documentary. Black September took advantage in 1972 of 24-hour color coverage, 24-hour color TV coverage, something that didn't. The Munich Games were the first event where that actually happened, and Black September knew that, and they knew to get their message across, the Olympics were a great platform to do that, because you had the world's media already there broadcasting their message. And then finally, I think the bottom, I think everyone is aware of this. This is ISIS using YouTube and social media to advance their message. And again, when you hear ISIS's social media or ISIS's messaging campaign is unprecedented, that's not really true. Again, different groups have taken advantage of the communications technology of the time to get their message. So again, while terrorism might change, some tactics might change, some group dynamics might change, the strategic messaging cornerstone tends to remain consistent. So we just going through preview again. Readings: Hoffman's chapter 1 through 4. Chapter 2 through 4 on Hoffman deals with the history, and then chapter 1 deals with definitions of terrorism. 4 Waves of Terrorism, excellent article. It packages the history of terrorism pretty nicely, and you have that in your course pack. And then One Day in September, which is, I think, definitely the best terrorism documentary out there, if not the best documentary. And I think it's an excellent documentary. And as I said earlier, you can go online and watch it. I do not recommend watching it with children. It is not a kid-friendly documentary because of some of the brutality there. So just keep that in mind. And then the lectures, the key topics. So terrorism history part 1. And again, the first discussion will relate to terrorism history part 1. And the focus is on the 4 waves, how terrorism has evolved from its post-World War I or the anarchist wave and during the world prior to and shortly after the First World War to the current religious wave that we're seeing now. And again, you can agree with, disagree with rapports. He wrote the 4 Waves of Terrorism, his inferences, and you can bring those up in the discussion board. But again, is how has terrorism evolved throughout the last 100 years. And then the second lecture, and this is my favorite lecture of the course. What is a terrorism? What is not a terrorism? Or what is not a terrorist? And this asks you to read Hoffman chapter 1, because that gives some tentative definitions of terrorism. Listen to the lecture. And then in the discussion board, I give, I think, 9 examples. And I want to ask you in a short paragraph, is it terrorism or is it not terrorism? Why or why not? And first, this definition is very important. It's important because we want to have a good definition of terrorism that the United States recognizes, that the world recognizes. Because again, we get to put terrorists in a special category. We get to put terrorists in Guantanamo Bay. We don't get to do that with anybody else. We get to put people on no-fly lists without due process. There's no trials, just because we can say you're associated with terrorism. We don't get to do that with any other criminal act. If Donald Trump becomes president, excuse me, I think I just threw up in my mouth a little bit at that, but if Donald Trump becomes president and he wants to kill families of terrorists, then you have to know you have to define a terrorist very clearly. Again, that's a very hypothetical situation, but if that were to come to pass, having a definition of terrorist and deciding you are a terrorist and you are not is very key. So I always have fun with that. The point is to be controversial and to hopefully think about what a terrorist is, what isn't a terrorist in different ways. So I look forward to your points on the discussion board, and if there's any questions or issues, please let me know.